Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Kristy Taylor, founder of Work Solutions, and I'm excited for another episode of the Work Solutions podcast. And today we are talking about decatastrophization in the workplace, reducing stress at the team and systems level. As you know, at Work Solutions, we are all about being the prescription for career and workplace success. So I'm excited for my guest today, Dr. Amanda Fernandez, and we're going to be talking about resetting in the workplace and managing stress. And I'm going to first share Dr. Fernandez's bio because she is extraordinary. Dr. Amanda Fernandez is an ICF PCC credentialed executive coach. She's a board certified coach and founder of Waypoint North, where she helps mission driven leaders move from overwhelm to alignment through coaching based leadership and systems thinking. All that falls in line right into what we're doing today. I mean, I'm really excited to talk with you. And she has a background spanning C-suite fiscal leadership and organizational development, and she brings a rare blend of strategic insight and human-centered transformation to her work. Now, Amanda specializes in helping leaders strengthen self-awareness, communication, and team performance while building cultures grounded in trust and accountability. She is an international speaker and creator of the Waypoint system, which is a framework that equips leaders to lead like coaches and turn internal clarity into measurable organizational results. How are you, Dr. Fernandez? Welcome to the Work Solutions podcast. Did I miss anything in your bio? Extraordinary background here.
No, thank you. That was wonderful. And I'm super excited to be here with you today.
Well, I'm really excited for this discussion. For those of you tuning in, we often say, because people look at the Work Solutions and they see the RX, and I like to say that means that we are a prescription for workplace success. So when we talk about mindset and decatastrophization, this is a really timely conversation. When we talk about people experiencing stress in the workplace in today's job market. So I want to just kind of kick off a little bit with your background in terms of we're going to lay the framework here and actually define decatastrophization for people, because that might not be a word that the everyday person is familiar with, right? Those of us with a background in HR coaching and organizational development. For those who may be unfamiliar with the term, how would you define decatastrophization in the workplace center context?
Yeah, it's a great question, and so important to just lay down what the definition is. And I would say that at its core, decatastrophization is really a cognitive reframing technique. And in the workplace, it's really about intentionally challenging the worst case scenario mindset. So it's the process of taking those high pressure situations that often trigger an emotional, oftentimes exaggerated, catastrophic thought. For instance, if this project slips, we're going to lose the client. Or if this initiative fails, everything's going to fall apart. And it reframes it into a rational assessment of what are the actual spectrums of possible outcomes. So as a coach, I like to do, or actually like to work with teams to really move them from that emotional reaction to strategic data-informed responses. And it's really about building that habit of mind that pauses the what if everything goes wrong cycle, and it focuses them on what is the most likely to happen style of event. So what can we do right now?
Yeah, I love that. In my research, this is where I really discovered that word, right? And I talk a lot about, as I talk about my own principles, but in framework, I look at like what we do is HR and education professionals, but particularly from an HR standpoint, a lot of approaches from an organizational perspective with decatastrophization is when you look at changing and shifting organizational culture, they put policies in place. And that's one of the things that I kind of mentioned, like, yes, that is part of a strategy for decatastrophization in an organizational culture, but it's not just about the policies, right? We can't just, okay, I have a policy for everything. And I'm one of those type A personalities who will policy to death. But we have to look at the inner workings of an organization and understand our people and teams and how they work. Now, you've developed the Waypoint system. And so as we go into this conversation, I would love for you to share a little bit more about your framework and how you lay the groundwork for doing this with your clients.
Yeah. Well, I think what's important is really just knowing how it shows up, right? So how does it show up in a team or in the organizational level? And so the important thing to note is that it rarely presents as simple panic, right? Sometimes we just think like, oh, catastrophic thinking is going to be panic. It's actually a little bit more insidious than that. At a team level, you're going to see this as paralysis and inaction. It's really going to look like a fear of failure so great that people start to really overanalyze or stall in their decision-making capabilities. It can actually show up as toxic communication, such as finger pointing, defensiveness, and the big one, which would be breakdown in psychological safety. And that really happens because everyone starts to operate from a place of self-protection. And then if we look at a systems level, it shows up as short-sighted, reactive decision-making. And organizations become so focused on putting out their fires. So really coming from that perspective of responding to the crises that's happening, that they stop investing in proactive strategies, the innovation, those long-term, health pieces for the organization. And then that whole system starts to just operate off of adrenaline, which we know is exhausting, it's inefficient, and it leads to burnout and high turnover. So in my keynote work that I do, I really describe this as a leader who is an overwhelm tactician. So somebody that has lots of motion, lots of effort, but very little strategic navigation is happening. One of the most important things that I've learned is that catastrophic thinking doesn't always look like panic, like I had mentioned. It sometimes looks like silence. I actually have a client who is incredibly capable. They are deeply analytical, innovative, someone who brings real intellectual firepower, I would say, to their work. But their organization routinely offers projects for anybody who has bandwidth, and it does not have clear ownership structures of projects. So my client had created an entire framework, analysis included, brought the project forward, and then lost it due to this. Somebody else ended up operationalizing it, and my client wasn't even credited. So now my client is in this perpetual cycle of catastrophizing before they speak. So it really looks like they sit with their compelling idea for weeks. They start running those worst case scenarios through their head. Like, what if this gets taken again? What if I'm overlooked again? And then they start weighing that benefit of, is the risk worth me losing this dynamic idea that I have? Their overall happiness and sense of fulfillment has dropped significantly, and they spend 4 to 6 hours a week at work catastrophizing. And in coaching, they're on the verge of tears as we start to work through this. But the important thing to note here is the organization has no idea that this is actually going on internally, because outwardly they look perfectly composed. But that's how catastrophic thinking hides, right? It's like, that's the whole reason why psychological safety, it's not a soft skill. It's really a structural one that we need to make sure that we're helping in that coaching capacity to build that psychological safety within organizations and leaders as well.
And I want to stay here for a moment, Amanda, because when we talk about catastrophic thinking, I like to also point out, and especially in the work that I do, when you have leaders who are managing change, right? And so I want you to kind of I would love for you to just hear I would love to hear your perspective on when we looked at this from a system standpoint, and you are a leader who is tasked with leading change within an organization, and you get that resistance, right? It's that same catastrophic thinking sometimes that of people getting out of their comfort zone of what could happen, or I may lose my job, that kind of impedes change. What are your thoughts as it relates to leading change and dealing with the decatastrofization process?
Yeah, I think what's super important is to make sure that we're moving from directive style leadership, so really being the ceiling of your team, to I coin it as like lead like a coach. So really driving curiosity, question-based type of leadership, and really you become the floor of support for your team at that point. And it's super simple. I mean, you can do it with just a few questions. So what do we actually know? So start to set that in reality. So no assumptions. Let's just talk about facts. What do we know? What don't we know? So let's identify gaps. And then the third thing that I like to ask is, what's our most likely outcome? Again, you're bringing them back to that realistic viewpoint of the situation. So you're really starting to ground them and get them away from that binary kind of thinking of, if this one bad thing goes wrong, everything, falls apart. And then the last question is grounding them into circle of control. So landing that circle of control question, which could be something as simple as, what can we control right now? What's something that we can do in the next 24 hours? And that brings them back.
Yeah, and leaders really have to be, right? I love what you said there, because leaders have to be at the helm of this. Some leaders will take change in an organization and kind of take it as a task. I have to do this, right? But when you go back to some of the basic principles of change management theories that we've been taught in the past, that you have to have that champion of change, that person who, and those techniques that you just mentioned, where you're putting yourself on the ground floor and creating that circle, right? And reaching people where they are, it helps to prevent some of that catastrophic thinking, because people begin to feel like that they're a part of the process and not just being pulled along. Now, you mentioned earlier, from an individual perspective, why individuals might be resistant, or ways to tackle this catastrophic change. In your experience, how does stress escalate, especially when it pertains to leaders? How does stress escalate when leaders or teams assume worst case scenarios, that catastrophic? How does it impact the overall team and morale?
Well, I definitely think that stress doesn't escalate in a straight line. I think it spirals, and what I call like a catastrophic feedback loop, right? So if you think about catastrophic thinking, it really triggers your natural fight or flight response. And so when a leader or a team defaults to that type of thinking, they're starting to narrow their focus. They're going to lose their access to creative problem solving and critical thinking. So let me just explain. So the loop works like this. A challenge arises, the team starts to catastrophize, the stress response kicks in, the performance drops, and then that validates that initial fear that a catastrophe is indeed happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
That leads to more stress, and then a deeper cycle of poor performance. So it becomes what would look like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in systems thinking, we call that a reinforcing loop, right? So that pattern that feeds itself. I'll give you an example. I'm working with a leader right now who has a team, and they're tasked with developing an innovative solution for an organization-wide challenge. Instead of really leaning into the opportunity of this challenge, the team immediately started to spiral. So they started blaming other departments for a lack of clarity around specific components of it. At one point, they were waiting for someone else to tell them what to do. And the whole project started to feel like a checkoff list rather than that creative challenge. And that's really a catastrophic feedback loop in real time, right? Because they waited in that cycle, they really felt stuck. And then the more they felt stuck, the more they looked outwardly for someone to blame. Well, through coaching, what we discovered was that the spiral started with their problem statement itself. So it was framed from a deficit perspective. So we did something simple. What we did is we shifted the framing from we have a problem to we have an opportunity. And that's positive psychology right there. So that positive psychology reframe, it really changed the entry point for the entire team. So they stopped defending against failure, and they started leaning into figuring out who they're solving for, and really what does that better future for the organization look like. So this is part of my Waypoint framework. It's really interrupting the loop by changing the story that the team is standing inside of. What I like to do with leaders is help them insert that pause moment, that moment where you're able to do a reorientation of where you're going to go. Because if you think about navigation, a waypoint is that confirmed position. It's going to tell you where you are so you can move forward intentionally. Leadership works the same way, right? So when leaders slow down their reaction, what they're able to do is they're able to locate where they currently are. So where am I currently right now? And let me ground myself in reality. And then let me pick my next waypoint? What is my way forward through this? And they change the trajectory of the system itself. And so what I like to tell leaders is stress spreads through systems faster than clarity does. And as a leader, your job is to really slow that system down long enough for people to have the opportunity to think. So we're moving again away from that reactionary, let's just have that knee-jerk reaction, to let me pause, let me have a moment to breathe, to think, see where I am, ground myself, pick my waypoint, and move forward.
I really love the work that you do, and I like the way that you kind of centered it on Waypoint. And it's in some ways I think about the similarity, because from an HR perspective, again, I look at this like, hey, we try to prevent catastrophization, right, by putting policies in place, by doing those things. But when you're looking at the individual, it's also getting them to reframe their mind set and understand their sphere of influence. And speaking of sphere of influence from a leadership perspective, leaders don't always recognize their sphere of influence and how their reactions impact the team. So as you're coaching and you're sharing your framework, what tips do you have for leaders to recognize their own reactions and how these reactions can actually unintentionally increase organizational stress or impact their team?
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at warning signs that leaders can start to dig in for themselves, I would say self-awareness is really the cornerstone here. Leaders often have subtle tells when they're under pressure. For instance, you may have a leader who speaks faster when they feel the pressure coming on. Maybe they interrupt more. Some will even lean into demanding immediate answers for things. But I would say that the one that I find the most common is solution jumping, is what I call it. So a leader that feels pressure immediately imposes a solution. And that is detrimental to the team because it bypasses the collective intelligence of the team. You then start to create a team. They stop thinking. They no longer think for themselves. And they're really just in this holding pattern, waiting for you to give them orders. I worked with a leader recently who felt that it was their responsibility to correct every mistake that their team had. And this led to them feeling extremely overwhelmed. They had what they described as a misalignment to their purpose because of this. And their work-life balance was completely out of whack. They had taken on so much responsibility. They were just unhappy with themselves, with the team. And so every time something went wrong, their instinct was just to immediately jump in and fix it. What we did was that practice piece that we were just talking about, right? And then asking a very strategic question in the moment. So pause and then ask myself, do I need to solve this for the team, or can I empower the team to solve it for themselves? And that is super important because that moves you into leading like a coach, right? And so you're able to replace the directive style leadership to then leading with curiosity, providing your team with support through those question-based approaches. And what was fascinating is the team really responded well to this. They started solving for themselves. They started relying on teamship, is what I call it, but on the team itself instead of coming directly to the leader to intervene. And their confidence increased, right? Think about it, right? Isn't that amazing? Like, that's exactly what you wanted. It's as simple as don't do it for them. Empower them to do it for themselves, and then ask them some really incredible open-ended questions, right? So ground them in where they are, ask them what their options are to move forward, make sure that they have the support that they need, leverage their strengths, and then, what is that actionable step? On a scale of 1 to 10, how committed are you to doing this next step? So just really kind of getting them into the groove of that. But what is great about this story is that the leader started to feel more aligned with the work that they were doing. They were proud of the team that they had. Their work-life balance came back into alignment. Their confidence grew. And it's a simple shift, right?
Yeah, I love that you talk about that shift in terms of just those little tweaks that the leader makes and it just letting go, stopping and asking questions that allows your team members to feel empowered and like they own a piece of the process. And again, that is a lot of them from an HR perspective when we look at this as a leader, that piece of letting go, right? And empowering your team to have that ownership. Like in most people, they can sit in a training and you can read a book and you can learn the principles and the tenets of what that looks like. But having the ability to apply it can be difficult, especially depending on your personality type, because some people don't want to let it go. Luckily, we are here with Dr. Fernandez, who specializes as a coach in teaching people about those communication techniques and recognizing those aspects of those things that they can improve with those little shifts. So when we talk about making those shifts, I really just want to touch for a moment on communication. And from a leadership perspective, what role does communication play in either amplifying or reducing stress? Because we just talked about how your sphere of influence as a leader. But let's go dig a little bit further in that. And from a leadership perspective, that communication process.
Yeah, I would say that communication is really the nervous system of an organization. So, what I mean by that is when communication is vague, when it's inconsistent, people are going to fill in those gaps with those worst case stories because it's just human nature, right? So, if we can remove ambiguity from our teams, then people begin to understand the expectations. They have the space to think because we're creating that through our shift of leading like a coach. And then the fear of the unknown decreases, which then leads to performance increase. And I feel like the communication piece is 100% hands down where a lot of work needs to go into, but something that we typically don't think about as leaders as making sure that we're aligning communication, right? So I would say that communication really builds stability. In my work, what I do is really wanting to slow down the reaction time so that you can build in that capacity for communication. So really pausing allows to move back into strategic thinking, which allows communication to flow back and forth. I'm a big proponent of communication profile assessments that for teams, I love it. So I did some work with a team where I used 5 dysfunctions of a team DISC profile. And it was wonderful just to see the psychological safety. Where were they when we started? Where were they when we had ended the coaching engagement? But what is great about that particular assessment is it has a comparative report that you can do. And so we did these, what did we coin it as? It was basically like a co-meeting with the 2 people who had the comparative report. And we set it up to where they were able to tell their teammate, here's how I show up at work like this. Here's how I like to be communicated with. And then on the flip side, so did the other person, right? And so at the end of it, and it was quick 30-minute meetings, at the end of it, they were able to really see our differences aren't differences, they're actual strengths. And here's how we leverage these differences to make each other better within our team. And that was one of the best things that the team said that we had done throughout the entire 6-month engagement was those comparative report meetings. And it's because they had the ability to not only share what they needed, but they could also figure out what their coworkers needed and how they had, from a positive psychology standpoint, that strength leverage to move forward together, right?
Yeah, I love that. When you talk about, I use similar assessments when I'm working with clients and in my workspace. And so when you talk about just those types of conversations, Dr. Fernandez, what are some practical strategies that leaders can use? I hear you talk a lot about this pause and reframing. What are some practical strategies that leaders can use when they help their teams to pause, right? Because we talk about the leaders in themselves, helping themselves to pause, but maybe the assessments you just mentioned that you are using with your clients is a part of that process, helping them to understand each other. But what are some practical strategies that leaders can use to help their teams to pause and reframe and think more clearly when they're under pressure?
I would say when they're under pressure and you're in that the fight or flight has already been triggered, keep it simple. Keep it simple. So I do this framework where it's a scale it, anchor it, activate it, super fast. First, scale it. On a scale of 1 to 10, how serious is this really? Okay. Second, anchor it. What's the most likely outcome versus worst possible? So now you're trying to pull them out of that catastrophe, right? And then third is activate it. So what is the single highest leverage action that you can take or we can take in the next 24 hours? So get them back into agency really fast, because I really feel that agency is the antidote to catastrophe.
Yeah, I just think that being really proactive as a leader, so that strategy just here is really what helps to anchor teams and get them refocused. Because you said earlier that cycle of catastrophe, right? Did I say that correctly? Right? Because the goal is to really to address these things head on and stop them from being in that cycle. And when you talk about reducing catastrophic thinking, how does reducing catastrophic thinking impact workplace culture, trust, and performance over time?
The reduction of catastrophic thinking, oh my goodness. I would say that the impact is profound if you think about it. So when you can decrease fear, you're going to increase trust. And I feel like that's just the fulcrum point there. And trust is going to be that engine of high performing teams. So I'm sure that you're a fan of like Patrick Lencioni, right? So if you think of Patrick Lencioni, he talks a lot about this. And I feel like when people become more transparent about mistakes, because they know that the response is going to be inquiry rather than punishment, they are freed up to have an enormous amount of intellectual energy instead of self-protection, right? So that whole fear of failing, instead of that, it would be turned into failing forward. And I love the term failing forward. You're smiling, so I know you know what I'm talking about. But just this whole idea of it's okay to try and not be 100%. It's okay to say, I tried it, it didn't land the best, but here's what I learned from it. Here's what I'm going to do next time. And I get to ideate and iterate again, and let's go, right? Failing forward is amazing. You need to build the trust. So you've got to reduce that fear to get a team to fail forward together. And then over time, your organization will become that true learning system that's adaptive and resilient and aligned. And then if you think about that, a culture that adopts that whole mindset is one that can reflect and one that can improve. And rather than reacting to every, challenge as like I like to say dumpster fire, right? Like that 911 crisis. They're really reflective in looking towards that long-term strategic action instead of the knee-jerk reaction.
I love what you said. I almost want to change the title of this, is teaching how to fail forward, because I mean that's the key. We do get caught up in that loop in cycle. I think it's almost a person's natural response, and I hate to go to negativity, but it's almost like when you hear something related to change, it's almost a person's natural response to just resist, right? Or to think of the most negative aspect. But being leaders or people, and people who are navigating that process, is really our jobs to mitigate that. And so all of the tips and tricks that you gave today, it starts with self and self-reflection in terms of being able to understand your sphere of influence and how it impacts organizational culture, right? But then on the flip side, I like to look at that and say leaders within an organization, because organizations, I'm sure many of you have taken these like organizational cultural organizational development type classes where we learn that organizations or we compare it to almost like biology. These are living organisms, right? So leaders have to look at themselves as a part of this living organism. And when you go to shape the culture of an organization, what can we do in terms of policies, framework, and how we're going to drive organizational culture as a whole to manage this process of decapitalization? Because especially when you're moving into shifting change or leading major projects, right? That has to be part of the organizational culture. And I would say this to leaders: if the first response from, if you say, okay, I'm going to move in and I'm going to create this change dynamic, and the as a whole, the first response collectively from the team is something, a negative response or resistance. That's a whole, besides your onesies, twosies, right? There's something within that organizational culture that has created this. And I think that you pointed this out where, leaders looking at I'm speaking of it from a systems level, but leaders looking at the individual level to see, what understanding themselves and how they may be improving their team, right? But then they're again encouraging holistically leaders from a group perspective, top leadership. What is the culture of your organization, and are we putting those processes in place to say we want to create these safe environments? We are creating these safe spaces. We want to create environments where people cultivate environments where people can be intellectually creative, right? And they don't feel like it. So any comment to that, because we're getting towards the end of this podcast. This has really been a great conversation, Dr. Fernandez, but any comments on that? And then we're going to talk about what you have coming up and what's next on your plate.
I would just say to that, I would comment that stress travels through organizations the same way that energy does, right? Top down, just like you were describing. So if a leader hasn't learned how to regulate their own reaction to pressure, they're going to unintentionally amplify the anxiety across the organization itself. And so if like that scenario you're just talking about, from the top, that particular leader at the very, very top has not learned how to regulate their own reaction, it funnels down to the entire organization. And so if you think about the organization in layers, it's extremely important that leadership development is looked at, and it's key within an organization. And that's why I focus on helping leaders lead like a coach, right? One thing that I like to say is you can't lead anybody further than you can lead yourself. So it starts from the inside out, right? Mm-hmm. So that internal self-regulation, you have to be brave enough, because it does take a lot of bravery to turn that and look inside, right? Do the inside work before you do the outside work. And so I would say that don't work harder, but work more strategically. Reduce that stress, identify your trigger points, build in your pauses, think about open-ended questions for your team.
I have enjoyed this conversation with you, Dr. Fernandez. Now let's talk about you and what you have coming up. So we had a great conversation today, really laying the groundwork, because this is a much deeper conversation when you start to integrate, what do we do from an organizational culture perspective, right? From an HR perspective to cultivate this environment. And then what do we do as leaders? And so we laid the groundwork for that conversation today, but you are a coach. You work one-on-one with organizations and individuals all of the time. You talk about some of the assessments that you utilize. And so what do you have coming up? And how can people, I don't want to say at this moment, how can people get in touch with you, but what do you have coming up on the horizon? All right.
Yeah. So on the horizon, I'm an author for a chapter of a book that we're still working on the title, but basically what it is a whole bunch of us came together. We are writing a chapter a piece, and the book is about the power of self-belief. And so if you think about that from a leadership perspective, and I talked a lot about some of the things that are in my chapter today, but really looking at yourself and saying, I believe in myself enough to make that next waypoint decision without all the answers, without external, motivators or anything like that. So I can make that decision in the dark because I'm comfortable and confident, and I believe in myself. And so I think as leaders, we get trapped with imposter syndrome a lot more than I think that we would like to share with other people. And so this chapter is really a story not only about my navigation, but a framework for other people to pull themselves up and say, okay, I've got some pretty big decisions to make, and I can do it because I'm going to do it one waypoint at a time. So I'm extremely excited about that piece. I have a couple conferences that I'm presenting at, and I have some more international speaking that's coming up in the horizon too.
Okay, I want to make sure that you had a full moment because I want to wrap up here with you giving us a final piece of advice, and then let us know how to get in touch with you. But what's the final piece of advice that you would like to share? And then for people who are listening, we're going to have all of her information in the description box below. But how can people get in touch with you? I mean, Dr. Fernandez, you can see that any of us who are in this coaching space, we just had a meeting last week, my team and I, and we talked about really emphasizing some of those cognitive-based testing models that we use, and you mentioned it here. But I think it's also important to go back to that as you wrap up. You give us this final piece of advice. Can you highlight some of the tools that you use as you go through and you're working with folks? Because what I want to emphasize here is that we're not just coming in. Dr. Fernandez is not just coming to your organization, as a coach. She's using these scientific cognitive model-based tools to be able to have and foster these conversations as the foundation. So let's do that, and then tell people where they can find you and how they can contact you.
Yeah, I think the easiest place to contact me would be LinkedIn, or you can reach out through my website, waypointnorth.org. And then in terms of frameworks, if we're looking at assessments, there's tons of assessments out there. EQI 2.0, I think, is amazing for leaders to really dig into. Love the DISC, love the 5 dysfunctions of a team. There's several different, ways to utilize those, and I think that's the beauty of some of those assessments. I know I said it in the podcast, but I am so thankful for communication profile assessments. So whether or not you use the one that I talked about, but just being really clear about your own needs and the needs of your team and being on the same page. I feel that communication is highly underrated in organizations, but it's one of those things that can really make or break a team. So I focus a ton on those elements. And I also think that having difficult conversations is something that teams really shy away from. So I did a lot with, I don't know if you know Keith Ferrazzi's 10 shifts from leadership to teamship, but this whole teamship concept of moving away from a top-down leadership into really this grounded leadership with shared responsibility and shared accountability. That is amazing work when everyone can come together and understand the ownership of all of those different responsibilities and being able to say, are we holding ourselves to the standards that we put in place? And if not, let's have a conversation about that. It doesn't need to be the elephant in the room.
I mean, this has been a really great discussion. Again, we laid the foundation here, and I want you guys to check out Dr. Fernandez's book when it's available. You can contact her on LinkedIn. Thanks for tuning in today. Remember, you can get our books, The Work Principle and the Work Principle Primer and the Work Principle Workbook, always available on Amazon. And stay tuned. We'll have some updates on Dr. Fernandez and keep her connected with our community. And I think it's a great conversation today regarding the decatastrophization process and what individuals and organizations can do to begin to reduce some of that stress dynamic on their teams and realizing and recognizing our sphere of influence. Again, thanks for tuning in to the Work Solutions Podcast, and we will see you next time.